now with this election, it's given them the chance to reignite that violent strategy.
I think a big question for a lot of people watching is why in the hell do we care? I don't care about Venezuela. I mean, if I were Venezuelan, I would care about Venezuela, right? I don't want to sound like I don't care about people. I care about people, of course, but I'm just saying I don't really care about Venezuela. I think a lot of people don't care about Venezuela. And I think that this sounds to me like a fight between the capitalists and the socialists or the communist, however people want to paint it. And it doesn't, and I don't really care. Honestly, I'm like, what do I care if Venezuela is capitalist? What do I care if they're socialist? What do I care if they're communist? What do I care if any country around the world is any of these things? I want to care about America. And so I think that's like a big question that people have on their minds is why in the world are we caring so much about Venezuela? Why in the world are our leaders caring so much about Venezuela? Countries all around the world have dictators or fake elections or coups that happen. I mean, all throughout the continent of Africa, we could start breaking it down country by country and having an issue with every single leader that's in power, right? But we don't. We don't pay much attention. But for whatever reason, there is a hyper focus. I mean, Juan Guaido carted into Congress, given standing ovations, right, during the State of the Union address. So what is it about Venezuela? And you wrote a whole book about this. So you are the expert on this. What is it about Venezuela that our government is like trying to make us care about this and trying to get us to support? Like I said, I don't care either way, whether Maduro or the opposition won. I mean, it doesn't matter to me. So what is it? Why are they doing this? What is their agenda?
Yeah, as an American, I would say it especially doesn't matter to me how someone, if I were in US government, it wouldn't matter to me how one leader or another came to power. If they control the military, if they control the borders, if they control the trade and industry, I'm just going to deal with them. And so forget, I mean, we know the US doesn't care about democracy. That's not, again, why they decide to side with Maduro or not. But let
Right.
me paint a picture for why Americans actually do have a stake in Venezuela, and that's a deep historic relationship ever since oil was discovered in Venezuela in the 1920s. The United States and Venezuela have had an inseparable relationship. In fact, World War II, the Allied victory in World War II would have been impossible without Venezuelan oil. I note in my book that at the beginning of World War II, England or Britain, the US's primary ally at the time, was dependent on Venezuelan oil for 40% of their oil imports, Britain being entirely dependent on imports for oil. By the time the US joined the fight, that number was more like 80%. So
Hmm.
they Venezuelan oil literally fueled the Allied victory in World War II. And since 2019, the United States has actually had an embargo on Venezuelan oil as part of the Trump administration's sanction package designed to deliver Juan Guaido to the seat of power in Venezuela. And
But why
what
do we
that
want the
means,
oil? I mean, we're oil sufficient as a country now, aren't we? We also have other countries that produce plenty of oil. Like, why don't we just leave this one country with oil alone?
well, I agree. I think we should be tapping more into our own domestic reserves and letting Venezuela do whatever it wants with its oil. But it's just a we were dependent on Venezuela for around 7% of our oil imports as of 2019 when that ban came down.
Hmm.
And there's an existing infrastructure there. We don't even have the full infrastructure in our own country to tap into our own oil wealth the way that we could. But there are these pipelines. There's a whole, Citgo Petroleum was a subsidiary of the Venezuelan state oil company. The gas stations that we use all across the country were tied directly back to Venezuelan oil supplies. And I would note that when Biden came in with his own oil ban in 2022 against Russia, at that point, I mean, that was basically a sanction against the US population because something I note in my book, and I show a graph of this, when Trump put on the Venezuela oil ban in 2019, as I mentioned, Venezuela was giving us about 7% of our oil imports at the time. Well, Russia's share of the market jumped 7%. I think because they were just buying Venezuelan oil and selling it back to us the way that the Indians are doing for Europe now. But then when Biden came in and banned the sale of Russian oil in the United States, that had the combined impact of cutting us off from both sources. So that was
Mm-hmm.
around 10%. The combined total of Russian and Venezuelan oil is 10% of our imports. Do we think that might have anything to do with the high gas prices and the subsequent inflation we've experienced here in the United States? I would say absolutely yes. And the Europeans right now as well, because of these sanctions on Russia, need Venezuelan oil. I mean, we might not as much as the Europeans do, just simply because, well, they don't have the resources that we or
Right.
anybody else do.
When I'm looking at the top oil producing countries, now this is just oil producing, and I know Venezuela has a bunch of oil that they're not able to produce. I think, right, because they don't have the refineries that are the infrastructure built. So because they are sanctioned to death, right? When I look at this list, yeah, it's a lot of enemies. I mean, it's a lot because we go around making a lot of enemies, unfortunately. So number one is the United States. We do produce the most oil in the world, but then it's Russia. Saudi Arabia is our friend right now, but that could always change. They're like a wild card, right? Saudi Arabia, that relationship's not always in the best position. Canada's number four. Okay, fine, friendly Canadians. So you've got the United States and Canada there, but then you've got Iraq, China, Iran, Brazil, which is a friendlier country, but then you've got the UAE, Kuwait, Mexico. I mean, there's a lot of adversaries or enemies or people that countries that we bully that are on this list. So do you think that the reason why the US wants to secure Venezuelan oil is because it's like a fail-safe in case Saudi Arabia turns on us? And then we need to have another place. And so we would turn to Venezuela because we've got that on lock or something.
Yeah, and when it comes to Venezuela, it's not only oil. I think that's definitely part of the strategy, but Venezuela also has the largest untapped gold deposits in the world, and I think in some ways that could be more valuable in the future than oil.
Mhm.
And and it's important to keep in mind that for the much of the last century, Venezuela was top three oil producer. It is only since sanctions came into place that let me just step back and explain it this way. Since Venezuela discovered oil, or actually Dutch explorers working for Shell discovered oil in Venezuela in the 1920s, Venezuela developed as a total petrostate and was completely dependent on the international oil market in order to keep their own industry alive. That's the way that neoliberalism works, right? Is that it comes in as part of this international hand, the IMF, and manages your economy, tells you what you can and cannot spend money on, who you can export to, of course, which companies, European and American, that can operate in this case Venezuela, and they just run it for you, right? The refineries, your oil economy, it's all run by foreign corporations. So Venezuela, and this is by design so that these countries cannot be independent, never fully developed its own production capability when it comes to actually building the refineries and upkeeping them. That's just something that foreigners always did. And so
Mm.
now, since they've lost access to some of the major parts, and for a while even the inputs, meaning the chemical inputs that they needed in order to pump their crude, because their crude is extremely dense, like molten tar, um, that led to a crash in the oil economy. And I cite an actual opposition aligned economist, major Maduro critic based in the United States, Francisco Rodriguez, who analyzed Venezuela's oil industry and put it up against every major sanction the US levied against the country in just a basic chart. And he found that for every major drop in the Venezuelan oil industry, there was a major US sanction that coincided with the date of that drop. And he said that this counted as like a statistical smoking gun, uh, uh, implicating the US in what he said was a surgical strike on Venezuela's oil economy. Now,
Mm.
in the last few years, Iran, another major oil producer that has been under sanctions for much longer than Venezuela, has actually stepped in. There were mass oil shortages in Venezuela in 2019 and 2020. You might remember Iran sent those shipping freighters, those huge ships to Venezuela with all of these chemical inputs and lighter crude that they needed in order to revive their oil production capacity. And it actually turned their production capabilities around. But more significantly, in recent years, Iran has actually signed deals to rebuild Venezuela's damaged refineries. And so that would be a step that completely takes Venezuela out of dependence on the West and will insulate them from future sanctions damage. And I think Venezuela will get back to where they were before. But and at that time, and this time around, once they're producing like they were in the last century, they'll be part of this multipolar alliance in BRICS. You mentioned Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Russia, China, Brazil, those other oil producers. Well, now they've all started only in the last year openly uh, building this alternative global financial network that will not be dependent on the dollar, not be dependent on the West for their parts and for their exchange. And Venezuela is going to turn to them. I wouldn't be surprised if Maduro survives this latest escalation by the opposition, if Venezuela is now led into BRICS in Russia later this year. So that's something the US would hate to see happen, especially because, as I mentioned, this is not only about oil, this is about plenty of other natural resources Venezuela is rich in, including, as I said, the largest untapped gold deposits in the world, which I think will be a key part of BRICS going forward as they build
Yeah.
this alternative system.
So who's behind this then? Is it our government that actually cares about grabbing, securing this oil and securing this gold? Is it the government players, or is it the oil companies, the corporate companies who care and they're pressuring the government to I mean, we've seen over the last few years, I mean, attempted coups on Maduro. They tried to kill the guy. I mean, they named, like you mentioned, named another guy as president, claiming they're all for democracy. We're for democracy, but here's a guy that we're going to instill. And as you mentioned, they then said to any other candidate that wanted to run, no, you're not allowed to run. Our guy, only our guy can run, not anybody else, because we want our guy to win. So it's anti-democratic. So they don't care about democracy at all. So who is it that is behind this, pushing and pulling, the levers in order to put the maximum pressure on Venezuela?
Well, the title of my book is Corporate Coup, and that's obviously because of the corporate interests that were working to coup Venezuela at the time or throughout the story that I tell in my book. But at the end, the conclusion that I basically arrived to is that the corporate coup took place in our government a long time ago. And that's why our government doesn't actually work in the interests of the American people. If
Right.
it did, then it would just deal with Venezuela in good faith, accept Venezuela for what it is, and yeah, if you want the oil, make a deal with
Right.
Venezuela to get the oil. But they don't work in our interests. They just work in this zero sum game where, yeah, these corporations, Exxon and other players, really can't tolerate allowing these countries to be just even the slightest bit sovereign, and that includes the United States, I would say. So who is behind the opposition at this time? Well, I mentioned Maria Corina Machado and her longtime connections to the State Department. There are photographs of her meeting George W. Bush in the Oval Office back in 2003 when she was being trotted out as the leader of the opposition then. But she is just the force behind Edmundo Gonzalez, who was the official candidate in this election. But his biography also sheds some light on the players that are orchestrating this latest opposition push in the street. And that is, well, Elliot Abrams. He's still advising the Biden administration. That's the Iran Contra indicted criminal for his role in running dirty wars in Latin America throughout the 1980s, who served as the Trump envoy to Venezuela after the initiation of the coup attempt in 2019. But I'm very willing to bet, has a deep relationship with Edmundo Gonzalez because Gonzalez was a high level functionary in the Venezuelan foreign ministry throughout the 1980s in the pre Chavez era, when Venezuela was closely allied with the United States. And he actually was stationed in El Salvador in the Venezuelan embassy there in the 1980s at a time when the US and Venezuela were running these dirty wars under the direction of Elliot Abrams. And so it's remarkable to me, really, that someone so openly criminal and who's really been bouncing around Washington or the swamp since the 1980s is still around in the US government. and basically gets no attention. I mean, he, I think, is one of John Bolton gets a lot of face time. He gets a lot of criticism. He doesn't really seem to care that he's this, hated figure throughout much of the politically aware US population. But Elliot Abrams, on the other hand, kind of flies under the radar, and you have to be a Latin America wonk to really even know who
Yeah.
he is at this point. But he's
Kind of like
still
a
there.
Victoria Newland, right? Where like a lot of people didn't realize who she was or what she was doing behind the scenes. And then she kind of became more, well, people that really follow would then know who Victoria Newland is. And Elliot Abrams is that same sort of figure.
Hmm. Yeah, these are the dark creatures that have made the swamp what it is. And,
Hmm.
I just think it's so important that Americans really learn about these dark, shadowy figures that stay in our government, regardless of who's in power. I mean, that these are the people that make our government run, regardless of, it doesn't matter if Trump's in there or if Biden's in there, they're the ones spinning the wheels.
I think American people we have to ask ourselves, when we have a government that is just operating on behest of the corporate interests, business owners, our military. I mean, the military actually was created the Navy was like the first branch of the military, and it was created to protect merchant ships that were going around, so it's protecting those trade and businesses. It's not about the individual, it's not about the citizens or the collective people of America. It's about protecting the corporate interests, protecting trade, protecting markets. And I think when Americans realize, and that kind of becomes like more of an ingrained understanding that that's what the military's for, that's what the government's for, that they don't work on behalf of we, the American people, then we can start asking, once we kind of wrap our minds around that, we can maybe then start asking questions about, do we want this government to represent, they're representing we, the American people. Do we want them to be operating in this way? Do we want them to be flexing their muscle? And they lie to us point blank to our faces, right? They say, oh no, it's for democracy. And as I mentioned, there's 150 other countries around the world that aren't so-called democratic. We're not doing anything about it. They're picking and choosing, not because of democracy, but because of some other interest, some money-making interest. And it's often been throughout our lifetimes about the oil, from Middle Eastern wars to going after Latin America. I mean, before that, I know it was bananas, which sounds bananas. Um, but I think when Americans really ingrain that rather than just hearing, because I think what happens right now culturally is we kind of hear it, we understand it, but it hasn't really been truly internalized. And until it's internalized and we're like, oh no, our government doesn't work for us, do we want them then to be going and doing all these things on behalf of these corporations? Maybe we would then speak up and say, we don't really want you soiling our name as Americans and doing this to other countries around the world. Like, you're doing this under our name and with our dollars, henchmen for these corporations so that they could go in there and make a bunch of money. I mean, that's what this is really about, right? These corporations want to go in there and they want it to be capitalist, so they could go in there with their money and their infrastructure and be extremely enticing to the people and say, we got the big bucks, so we're going to help build you. And really, they're the ones making all the money and not the actual Venezuelan people, which is what they're seemingly trying to change. It seems like that government's trying to make that change, or at least not be dependent on foreigners, which is just a really bad idea. Even if it has nothing to do with capitalism or communism or social, like, take that out of it. It's a bad idea as a country to be reliant on foreigners at all, whether they own your business, they own the corporations that then are using your resources. I mean, it's just or if you're importing in tons of stuff and you're not exporting anything, it's just a bad idea. You can't possibly be sovereign like that. You can't last. And that's the lesson Venezuela learned, right?
Exactly.
The corporations took off and then they crumbled, and they're trying to build back their infrastructure. And that's growing pains. That's going to be tough no matter
Yeah.
what.
Yeah, it is. And they've worked to build up their domestic production capabilities in terms of just basic products, food, and things like baby formula. They were completely dependent on imports for, or basic clothing goods, and so now there's this whole movement through the communes. Actually, Venezuela has this whole fourth branch of their government called the communes, the comunes, where they've been working on building industrial capacity and building farms, and taking land back from people that were hoarding it and no longer even living in the country. and
Mhm.
actually working with the US to try to overthrow the government. So there is that angle of things. But since you brought up not being dependent on foreigners and how the US public should really wake up to what their government is up to, and the fact their government doesn't work for them, it's not only corporations and banks that are running US policy. A group that we really can't overlook here, especially when it comes to Venezuela, are the foreign lobbies. The Israeli lobby, of course, reigns supreme in the United States, but the expat Cuban and Venezuela lobby and voter group in Florida really acts
Yeah.
like a gang, really acts like a gang. And they have a lot of influence, even if Trump's instincts on Venezuela are correct, which, based on my understanding of Trump and the memoirs that I read of his officials, Trump wanted to meet with Maduro and just resolve things face to face. I think he's the kind of guy who respects a tough leader. He sees Maduro as a tough leader. And Trump is also someone who's showed a willingness to sit down with demonized figures and make a deal. I think the main obstacle to that in the case of Venezuela is the lobby, is Florida, because
Mm,
you don't have a anti-North Korea lobby even the way that we
right.
have an anti-Venezuela lobby. So for him to go sit down with Kim, he wasn't going to lose a major state. He wasn't going to lose Ohio or lose
Right.
Pennsylvania for doing something like that. And instead, he has to pander to this base of people that they do not have the interests of Americans at heart. They are foreigners who actually want to use US tax dollar, US policy. And I'll say, if it came to it, as Maria Corina Machado herself has called for a U.S. invasion of Venezuela in order to overthrow the government, they would spill American blood and, of course, Venezuelan blood in order to return themselves to power. That's class of people, and that's what my book documents. I go through many characters in this shadow government appointed by the Trump administration and reveal that they're all just tools of different corporations that are seeking to get back into Venezuela. And these are the class collaborators, the Venezuelan traders, really, that just only care about their pocketbook, don't care about Venezuelans, don't care about Americans. And these are the people that drive policy in the United States. And so it's really dangerous. It's really dangerous for America first, because you can't have an America first policy in our own neighborhood, which should be the most important region, to be honest. With these figures around, they're
Yeah.
everywhere. They were in Trump's national security team. I'm worried about who would be Secretary of State in his administration. Would it be Marco Rubio? I mean, because that would be a disaster for Venezuela. Would it?
That would be
Would it
terrible.
be? Could it be Nikki Haley? I mean, these are the
Oh.
figures. These are the figures that have positioned themselves around Trump now, and I'm honestly concerned.
Hey guys, this was just a clip of a longer show. Catch the full show by going to KimIversonShow.com. It is free. It airs Monday through Friday, 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern. You could go back now and watch this full interview. I highly recommend it. Again, go to KimIversonShow.com. Thank you so much for watching.